we've got quite a few people that have joined us already. Cindy, I'm super eager to get started because I know we have a lot to talk about and a lot of excitement in you joining us. I'll get us started. Um, and we'll keep letting people in as we go. So yeah, welcome to everyone. Really excited to see such a strong turnout for today's webinar. Yet again, we've had some great ones in a row. So just to explain our webinar series for those who have not been here before, in partnership with Thrive Impact Fund and the University of Victoria's Impact Investing Hub, Spring's webinar series is part of our broader effort to provide practical and applied learning to advance blended finance education here in Canada. In these sessions, we examine the how-to of blended finance, unpacking cases, examples, and tools to learn what's working from leading practitioners. I'm Tasha Truant, the Director of Ecosystem Engagement here at Spring. I'm speaking to you today from Ottawa on the lands and waters of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, where I am grateful to live, work, and play. And today, I'm also grateful to be joined here today by Cindy Willard. Cindy Willard believes in the power of relationships and the intentionality of capital to create a more equitable world, better aligning finance and opportunity. She has deep experience as a thought leader in impact investing, blended finance, philanthropic strategy, and program development. As head of capital activation for the US-based organization Impact Charitable, she leads partnerships and project design to create funds and move money into impact first investing. Cindy is also a board member for the Vital Capital CDFI. Welcome, Cindy, and thank you very much for joining us.
I'm so thrilled to be here. I was so excited to be invited and just also want to acknowledge briefly that I'm joining you today from Colorado, which is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples, and also recognizing that there are 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to these lands that we now call Colorado. And looking forward to our conversation today and welcome questions from folks when we get to that point, and excited that you're all thinking about this space.
Thank you. Yeah, and absolutely. Folks, put your questions in the chat as they occur to you. The amount of time we'll leave for Q&A is dependent on how much we see the questions popping up. So just, yeah, keep putting them in there as we go. Yeah, and before I start on the questions we have for Cindy today, just a little bit of context. In Canada, DAFs have become one of the fastest growing ways that Canadians give. Well Funded released a report just this week, which is incredible timing for our webinar. If anybody from Well Funded is on the call, thank you very much for giving us some data right while we needed it. And the Well Funded report showed that DAF assets now total $17.3 billion. And here, DAFs have really taken center stage this year within the Canadian social finance ecosystem, exploring how to, meaningfully integrate them into impact investing and blended finance. And Cindy, since you were into the band before it was cool, we are very excited to have you here to share some of your wisdom with us. And yeah, so just to get started, Cindy, can you tell us a bit about Impact Charitable and the role that you play in helping philanthropic capital move differently?
You bet. We think of ourselves as a custom impact capital solutions provider. We do hold donor advised funds, and we think of those as a really important tool in that ecosystem. But we're really here to fill capital gaps created by systemic inequities and to move money differently. We feel like the finance system, particularly in the US, is not really structured to support everyone. And so we want to come up with those alternatives. We want to move toward impact. We really want to move money differently. So we're a firm that provides partnership, problem solving, bespoke solutions for those folks who might consider themselves as frustrated pioneers in this impact first investing space. And so trying to support those folks. We did some positioning research earlier this year, and one of the things that stood out from one of our partners is she said, "You find the wisest way to yes." So, in
Mm.
thinking about, how we move capital differently, we really start with that orientation toward let's make this happen, and then we do the work to figure out the wisest way to get to yes and the wisest way to move the money to help support that impact. We adjust our diligence to focus on impact over finance. We think about who leads projects and who will benefit from them. So who are those folks who've been left out of the systems where this capital can really have a meaningful impact in moving community projects forward? And then we spend a lot of time thinking about the how. So how is the money structured? How are we focusing on impact? What's the most generative and least extractive way to move the money? And thinking a lot about those kinds of things. So we measure ourselves on capital moved, not on assets under management.
Mm.
So as we think
Nice. Yeah.
about reworking a lot of the things in traditional finance that aren't serving us very well, this idea of sort of hoarding assets is not what we are here to do. We are here to actually flow money and to get it moving. So, some folks have described us as an intermediary or like the plumbing that makes these transactions flow, but we're really here to try to get more capital off the sidelines and out into the world. And DAFs are a great opportunity to think more about that.
Wonderful. And Cindy, just from your introduction and your approach, I can tell you you are so super aligned with a number of the players, the thinkers in the social finance ecosystem here in Canada, many of whom are on this call. And so just great to see how aligned we are. Um, yeah, starting from the basics. So for people who are newer to this space, how would you explain donor advised funds? And why are they such an important vehicle to pay attention to right now?
Yeah. I had someone describe a donor advised fund to me years ago as kind of a charitable checking account.
Mm.
It is a way to make the flow of that philanthropic capital easier. So I think for many, many years, people with a lot of extra assets. So once they'd reached there enough, they would have some extra that they wanted to provide to communities to move toward impact. And a lot of folks would set up a private family foundation. And I think what we know about that is that that's like running a whole other business. It
Mm.
isn't, there are lots of things. You have to file lots of paperwork. There are lots of rules and regulations, all the things. It's running a whole other business. I think the idea behind donor advised funds is to remove some of that administrative part and have your donor advised fund provider manage a bunch of that. And then you think about the outflows. So you think about the money going out the door. Where would I like this to go? How would I like that to be utilized? And so it was really meant, I think, to largely smooth that pathway. Um, I think a couple of the things that are helpful to remember about donor advised funds, and I'm sure many of you know this, is that once that money has been put into that donor advised fund, it actually becomes the asset of the donor advised fund provider. So the donor advisor gets to do just that. They get to advise it, but it isn't actually their asset anymore. And I think we've seen some interesting back and forths here in the US on that recently. Many of you may have heard about the kerfuffle around the Southern Poverty Law Center. So, our federal government decided, for whatever reason, that they were going to question the charitability status of that organization. And so, there were some donor advised providers, not Impact Charitable, who actually removed the Southern Poverty Law Center from the list of organizations that could be donated to, even though nothing had changed in their status. But that's something to remember about where you choose to put your money in a donor advised fund is that donor advised holder gets to make some of those decisions because it's their asset. Um, Largely in the US, donor advised funds have been used as a tax management tool as opposed to being positioned as the really amazing impact oriented tool that they are. But it's largely just a great way to help facilitate the flow of that philanthropic capital out into the world.
Can you tell us when you say a tax management tool, what that looks like?
You bet. So if you have a large income event, at least this is a little bit on sort of how US taxes work, which may or may not be of interest to you, but this is why DAFs have become this tax mitigation tool. So if you have a large amount of income that comes into you, you may be taxed on that, right? Because you're taxed on income here in the US. And so you can mitigate that tax bill by moving money to a 501(c)(3, so making a charitable contribution. sometimes if you have a large event, so you sell a company, you have a really large inheritance. You are earning far more in that year than you thought you might. Sometimes wealth advisors will say, hey, what you could do is you can open up a donor advised fund, make that
Yes.
contribution,
Yeah.
and that reduces your tax bill.
Okay.
Yep.
Wonderful. I'll pull us out of the weeds of taxes and ask you about grant making or what else you can do with a DAF. So I think we do often talk about DAFs as a grant making tool. Obviously, we titled this conversation today using it as catalytic funds. So yeah, tell us what else can a DAF do? How is Impact Charitable using DAF capital for impact investing? And yeah, if you have any examples to share too, that would be great.
You bet. I'll talk for a little bit and then I'll pull up a few slides because I think sometimes visuals are really helpful. I know they are for me. So I put a
Absolutely.
couple of things together for us today. The great thing about donor advised funds is they can do all kinds of things. Grant making is one amazing tool, but they can do investments of any stripe, which is really great. I think this flies under the radar a lot because largely donor advised funds have been used as a grant making tool, which is really helpful. I think what we often forget is that while that money is waiting to go out or until you decide to make grants with it, it's being invested somewhere. And
Hmm.
often that somewhere is in direct opposition to what you might be trying to do with the outflows of the money. So DAF assets have been invested ever since there have been DAFs. And I think what we think about, and I think obviously this audience thinks a lot about, is that all investments have impact. And so, how do we think about the best and highest use, particularly of this philanthropic capital? So, you've already given away this money. This isn't what you will be living on. This isn't what you will be sending your children to college on. This is, you've decided that this money is for good. And so then we feel like it's able to do a huge range of really amazing things. We were actually, Impact Charitable was actually founded to do just that, to make sure that all DAF assets that we held were invested for impact all the time. That was our original setup 12 years ago. We've added a lot of things to what we do, but we really help folks and specialize in making direct investments from their donor advised funds. I'm going to pull up my screen here just to share a visual that we have. Let's see. I think this is going to be the right thing. Are you looking at a list of 19 different ways that we have moved money out into the world?
We are. We are
Okay,
also seeing the bottom of the slides, like not the present
got it.
view.
Let me see. Is that
There we
better?
go. Yes,
Okay,
thank
probably
you.
a little bit larger for those of us who need glasses. So helpful. Um, this is a list of the 19 different ways that Impact Charitable has moved funds out into the world. Um, all of these are eligible to be made through donor advised funds. And I think you can see here, and I imagine many of you have used a lot of these tools in thinking about how we get to impact first. So all of our investments at Impact Charitable are impact first, which means we evaluate the impact above finance, although we do very much expect a return on the investments that we make. And we also make grants through our donor advised funds. But we feel like it's important to think about problem first and tool second. So, how are we assessing what's needed by the investee in order to get to that impact? And then we structure the capital once we know the answer to those questions, as opposed to coming in and saying, we have this one tool and we can do this one thing in this one way. We really try to be adaptable. And we feel like donor advised fund capital is uniquely positioned to be able to do that. Again, you have put this money into the world to do really good things. And so we feel like it can be more adaptable. It can view risk differently. And what I mean by that is that a good friend of mine, Rodney Foxworth, said years ago that risk is code for bias. And so, how
Mm.
do we think differently about risk, accounting for our own bias in these conversations? And how do we share risk appropriately across the transaction instead of putting it all in one place, which usually means all on the investee, which is really hard because as we're trying to make change, as we're trying to do things differently, we need to think about different systems and structures to do that. And we think reimagining risk is part of that. I'll move to this next slide. And I'll talk through a few examples, and I'm happy to talk through all of these, or we may want to move on to something else. But these are all examples of investments made directly into these entities through our donor advised funds. Beneficial Returns, which some of you may know about, is a firm that's focused on providing loan products to social enterprises working to reduce poverty and support environmental regeneration across Latin America and Southeast Asia. So one of our donor advised fund folks, this was his first donor advised fund, but he was really interested in doing impact investing. He opened it up with us in January, and by March we had moved $100,000 into beneficial returns to support this work. So part of what we think about too is kind of the speed and moving the money in the way that makes sense. But Beneficial Returns does an amazing job of working with these smallholder farmers, with these small businesses, and really providing the capital that they need to grow. And by this donor advised fund providing a 1% loan on a 5-year term, it really allows them to move that capital in ways that really get to impact. When that money comes back, this donor advisor is going to be able to use that money again. So it's really a nice recycling, if that's a helpful way to think about this donor advised fund money.
Mm.
Oftentimes, folks are told by a very large donor advised fund provider. In the US, we have Fidelity Charitable is actually the largest nonprofit in the United States because they hold so much donor advised fund money.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, they have billions and billions and billions of dollars sitting in donor advised funds, and which is a little bit counterintuitive. And I know we're going to talk about how we might be able to right
Yeah.
size DAFs as a thing. Um, Often they will tell people, depending on how many assets you have, that they won't make an investment for you. And this Middlemarch Housing was a donor that had his DAF at Fidelity Charitable. He wanted to make a $250,000 investment into affordable workforce housing in his neighborhood. And Fidelity Charitable told them that they wouldn't do it for him. So he was able to
Mm.
find us, which is great. We made a preferred equity investment into some permanently affordable units in San Diego, which is a high cost housing market here in the US. And these are units meant for folks who are in that sort of middle income earning space. So think teachers, think first responders, think firefighters, right? Who have steady employment but aren't making an outsized amount of income. And we really need that affordability to exist in our communities so that we can have a range of people and services and support and community that we all want to have. So we were able to help move that money for this donor advised fund provider. I'll talk about Deerfield and then I'll stop and we can see if we want to have more examples, if we want to move on to other questions, because I could talk about the amazing things that our donor advised funds do all day. But we actually took a limited partnership position in the Deerfield Fund for Black Wealth, and that's a fund here in Colorado, which helps first-time Black and African American homeowners with down payment assistance. So it's basically a shared equity appreciation model, and we were able to work with a donor advised fund who was really thinking about ownership and the wealth gap and how we try to solve for that. And Impact Charitable does not have any issues taking an LP or an equity position in an impact focused fund like this. And we were able to move $1 million into that fund, which was really exciting as the fund was getting going. It helped them gain some momentum and really access that capital again that's focused on impact. But the LP position was how this fund was set up based on their model. And so we were happy to accommodate that and move the money into that position.
So Cindy, we're on track, and I know from the past our audience is really into examples, so I would say keep going.
Perfect. I
Yeah.
will. Love
Thank
it.
you.
So we have another donor advised fund that works in a smaller community here in Colorado. Um, and they had been working with a nonprofit organization called Peak Education. And as perhaps is the case in Canada, but certainly is the case here, that often with government funding or even school district funding, it's on a reimbursement basis. And so one is expected to do the work and then get paid at the end. And that can be really difficult because a lot of this work involves people who also would like to have a life. And so we provide a working capital loan at 0% for 6 years for this organization so that they could weather those gaps in
Hmm.
reimbursement and really bridge those capital gaps between the work that they needed to do for their community and the reimbursements that were going to come in. And again, a 0% loan is pretty great. I think our average lending rate here in the US right now is somewhere between 6 and 7%. And that's if you don't have any, again, risk associated with you. And often banks view nonprofits as risky because they don't really understand that business model. So this is saving that organization a lot of money over time and really
Hmm.
making more of their work possible, which is exciting. We had another donor work with a group called Food Connects, and they're up in Vermont. They're basically an organic aggregator of produce for folks. As you may know, Vermont has lots of amazing smallholder agriculture and smallholder producers. But getting that to market and aggregating those products can be difficult. And so Food Connects provides the infrastructure to do that. They provide a lot of really high quality, nutritious food to the school districts and to education systems in Vermont, as well as creating a market for a lot of these small holders across the state. Um, they were building out a larger facility that had more storage capacity and more cooling capacity for all of the products. And so we had a donor advisor that offered a 2% loan over 5 years to help them bridge that construction. Because, of course, getting the thing built and then building up the additional revenue to fill the space that you've just built takes some time. And so by allowing some low cost, very patient capital to come in, it really helps accelerate this amazing social enterprise that is helping more small shareholders work on regenerative practices, as well as moving more nutrition and organic food to the folks in the state who can really benefit from it. The last example I have here is a group that's called Spark Hope Automotive, and they provide low cost and in some cases free automotive repair and maintenance for single moms. Their whole goal is to make sure that those moms are able to continue to have access to work and education and to continue to support their families. And so they have a couple of automotive shops, and they were adding a third one based on demand, and they needed to purchase the building in order to do that. So we actually, in this case, brought together 7 different donor advised funds that all wanted to support this one organization. We provided some low cost, very patient debt, and the group was able to expand their capacity by another third. So that and translated into another 200 to 300 moms a year who were getting the ongoing automobile maintenance for their families. And I think this is probably the same in many places in Canada, but certainly in the United States, we are a very car-centric culture. And so having a car that works actually enables so many of the other parts of your lives. And so this organization was able to measure the maintenance and increase in the job wages that these women were able to get, and also the things that it allowed them to provide for their children. So think about taking them to practice after school, right? Being able to support them, getting back and forth to different activities and different places, all of those things. And so it was a really impactful loan that these folks gave. And again, we were able to bring a bunch of folks together, which was really exciting. And so this is just a smidge. We have about 90 different investments that we hold, many on behalf of our donor advised funds that again are really focused on that impact first and are coming in on terms that are catalytic. So when we think about the term catalytic, what we mean is that it's enabling something to happen that wouldn't if you were going after traditional finance. So often it's price, so the price of capital and keeping that manageable for folks. Sometimes it's coming in at that position. So in the Deerfield Fund, because we came in early, it provided that momentum, and we see that as being catalytic. So all the kinds of things that we think about in structuring these investments. This is just a sampling, but we have lots of amazing things. All of this is possible through donor advised funds, and we think they're an amazing tool to do this exact kind of work.
Wonderful. So did you want to stop sharing? Oh, you got it. Okay.
They did,
Great.
yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. Lots of great examples. And I think a lot of people were probably taking notes just then. Um, I mean, you kind of just covered this, but I'll go ahead and ask the question anyways. So what makes DAF capital potentially catalytic in a blended finance structure? Where can it sit in the capital stack? And what kinds of risks or gaps can it help address? Keeping in
Yeah,
mind your new definition of risk as you just introduced it, but
you
putting
bet.
that all out there.
Yeah. Yeah, we think DAF Capital has so much potential to do all different kinds of things. And I think because again, um, what I found throughout my career is we think about money differently. If we think we are going to have to live on it, if we think it lives in the bucket here that is more traditional finance, we put a lot of constraints around it. So sort of how much we expect to get back, what that has to look like, understanding those terms. We find often that with this donor advised fund capital, people are willing to imagine more with it. They're willing to think a little bit differently and think about, um, if I accept a return of 1% on loan capital as opposed to 8%, right? What does that enable in terms of impact? And so we think there's a much better ability to balance risk, impact, and return, which is really how we all think about impact investing, right? It's balancing all three of those things as opposed to just risk and return, which is a more traditional finance capacity. But really building in that impact component, we think is what makes donor advised funds different. And I think they can play anywhere along that continuum. We've seen um, donor advised funds serve as a guarantee or a loan loss reserve pool, right? And that's actually a place where we could make a grant into someone's loan loss reserve that enables all of this other capital. And where that's a grant and not an investment, as we think about blended capital, right? How can that help enable the impact and do all of the things? Donor advised funds can do that. Um, I think they can prove out new models of social enterprise. So again, as we're thinking about reimagining systems and getting them to work better, donor advised fund capital may be able to take those risks that others might not. Because again, if the investment doesn't work out, you've made a grant, which is what you
Yeah.
may have been
Yeah.
doing anyway. And so I
Anyways.
think, right, it's great. And so I think that frees up people to think about what's possible in ways that perhaps with other buckets of money, it's a little bit harder to do that. And so, if you're thinking about impact, sometimes even if the investment doesn't work out, it can still achieve amazing impact. We had an investment that we worked on with some indigenous restaurateurs who are thinking about creating a wholly indigenous supply chain and really creating some food sovereignty for the different tribal and indigenous nations that they were working with. The loan didn't perform exactly in the way we thought, but I tell you what, the impact from that project was monumental, and it would not
Mm,
have been achieved with a 1 year grant. And so I think, again, as we balance risk, impact, and return, there are all of those opportunities with donor advised funds that can be different than with traditional capital.
wonderful, wonderful example. Let's talk about opacity. We said at the beginning that we would go here.
Yeah.
One of the tensions we've been discussing is that DAFs can be very flexible, as you mentioned yourself, but also quite opaque. What are the risks of DAFs operating as a black box, and what would better transparency or accountability look like?
They are opaque. It is one of the worst things about donor advised funds. And I don't believe they were intentionally set up that way, but they sure as heck are now. And it's
Mm,
really difficult. It is nearly impossible to find out the person or the family behind a donor advised fund. I don't think that serves the system very well. And there's lots of interesting conversation here in the US about how we go about changing, so how we go about changing a number of things about donor advised funds. And that certainly is one of those things. I think, we could think about disclosure in a different way. So thinking about the holders of those donor advised funds having to list the folks who held the fund with them. We don't require that at all now in the US. Like that's not something that has to happen. Um, for very large organizations like Fidelity Charitable, that would be a hugely long list, and that's the cost of doing that business, right? So we could certainly think about those kinds of things. Um, yeah, I think it's tricky, and I think when I talk with folks, because we get asked this a lot, they're like, "How do I get money from donor advised funds?" The
yeah.
donor advised fund is a tool. It's actually a person behind that. And so my best advice at this moment in time, because it's hard to find out who owns those, is that it's really about individual fundraising. And then you ask folks if they would like to use their DAF as a tool. Um,
Okay.
it's
Because
different
we're getting a lot
than,
of questions about that, which is essentially
yeah,
like, how do we
yep,
build this into our strategy?
absolutely.
How do we get at that? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's tricky because with a foundation, at least here in the U.S., private foundations have to that you can find information about them. You can see their board list, you can
Hmm.
see who's on it, you can see all of the grants that they've made, right? You can track that back. And many foundations have websites and they want to be helpful. Fantastic. That is not the case with donor advised funds. And so it isn't like raising from foundations. You don't raise from DAFs. It's an individual fundraising process. And then you ask folks if they have a donor advised fund that they
Yeah.
would like to use. We're seeing some movement here and certainly a lot of momentum around um, multi-donor funds. And some of those are a little bit more proactive about saying, we're really interested in climate justice. And here are some things that we do around climate justice. And here's a way, here's a form that if you think you have something that might fit, fill out this form and we'll do that. We've seen that with some donor advised funds that are a little bit more proactive about reaching out and searching for opportunities to do that. Because there, at least in the US, there are no regulations around this right now. That is the
Mm.
exception, certainly, and not the rule.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there just sort of reflecting on your comments just now, is there a role around educating DAF holders as well?
Absolutely. Yep. I think part of the work to help shift donor advised funds to get more money off the sidelines and into the world is twofold. I think one, it's the master narrative around donor advised funds, and by that I mean exactly this, right? Having folks understand that opacity, having folks understand how they could help with that. Thinking about instead of pitching this as a tax advantage strategy, pitch it as this is the most amazing impact tool that you can set up,
Hmm.
and here's all the amazing things you can do, right?
Yeah.
So I think if we shift the master narrative, like how to use these, how to do this, how you can be the most amazing donor advised fund like implementer in the world, fantastic. Let's do that thing. Then I think there's some policy work that also needs to
Yeah.
happen. But I think both of those are on the table. And I think we're going to need both of those to try to shift these $17 billion and that's holy goodness, that's a lot of money. So it's significantly more than that in the US. So we got to figure out how we can move more of this out to do the amazing things it's meant to do.
And just to add one more stat from that report, that 66% of those assets are held by the same 10 sponsor organizations.
Yes, there is a high concentration of those. Absolutely. And I think yeah, we're gonna talk about some of these lessons and unintended
Yes.
consequences, but there.
Let's go there then. In the US, what have been some of the missteps or unintended consequences in how DAFs have evolved? And yeah, what are the lessons for us north of the border?
Yeah, I think that one of the largest things that I see from my perspective, and I've been an Impact Charitable for some time, but I also worked at the Women's Foundation and at a local community foundation, so I've had exposure to donor advised funds for a long time. I think the donor advised fund holders, so the organization that holds those funds, are disincentivized to have people spend them because their business model is predicated on assets under management.
Mhm.
So you can see that incentivizing people to spend those assets affects your business model. So I think we can reimagine that fee structure. We've tried really hard to do that at Impact Charitable. Again, we don't measure our success on assets under
Yeah.
management. We are a social enterprise and we charge for different things. We don't make our money on assets under like we've been very conscious about trying to rewire for this because it's very easy, right? Traditional finance is built on scale, it's built on assets, it's built on holding all of those things. So we are trying to reimagine that. It's tricky because we run up against these barriers a lot. And I think we need to figure out how to disconnect that for donor, like how do we, I don't want to put people out of business. Please don't hear me say that. I want us to figure out a different incentive structure to help us move this money in a different way so that everyone can benefit. Um, Again, I think being framed as a tax strategy is not helpful. The other things that have been talked about are setting a floor for distributions. So in the United States, private foundations are required to distribute a minimum of 5% of their assets every year. There is no such requirement for donor advised funds. Now, what I will say is that most donor advised funds holders distribute, they on average across the US, but some are more, some are less. The average distribution from donor advised funds is 20%, which is not bad. And that's still sitting on a lot of capital. And often those are a few funds and a lot of them are distributing zero. So how do we understand that? I think what we learned from setting that 5% floor, which or 5%, which was meant to be a floor and is now a ceiling. And what I mean by that is like people only do 5%, right? And they don't think about that other 95% very often. So I think setting those percentage targets can be tricky because there may be an unintended consequence of people seeing that as the limit as opposed to the opportunity. I think one thing that could be possible is thinking about a time limit for donor advised funds. So instead of, they can be forever. And some donor advised fund providers have a limit of 25 or 30 years or something like that. But what if we accelerated that to 5 or 10 and really helped folks think about like in this time period, what impact do I want to make and how would I like to move that money? So that might be a way to think about it. There's lots of different theories out there. We're involved in conversations about this regularly. But thinking about how to catalyze more of that capital is, what's the policy lever and then what's the master narrative lever that we pull on both of those
Hmm.
things to try to encourage people to do really great stuff. I think the biggest battle always is for people's time and attention, right? People
Yeah.
have a million things happening. Philanthropy, I think about catalytic capital all time, all day, every day. Not for everybody does that. I think lots of these folks do. But it's that time and attention as well. And so how do we incentivize? How do we create the structures? How do we make this accessible and possible for people, and make it easier so that when we get that time and attention, we can really make it happen.
Yeah. Or even knowing the right questions to ask.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You bet. You bet. For sure.
Okay. Um, let's talk about actions. So for donors or advisors listening and who are intrigued but cautious, what is a practical first step? How can they begin using DAF capital in a more catalytic way?
You bet. Uh, my favorite way to do things is to learn by doing. So, ask your friends and neighbors what they're doing. Look at the annual reports of donor advised fund providers and see the kinds of investments that are out there. Of the ones I listed, many of those would welcome additional capital.
Mm.
I think talking with folks at Spring and with Thrive, right? You all have an amazing amount of information. There are lists of impact focused funds that one can find in lots of places. So there's the Transformative 25, which really looks at impact focused funds. There's a list of those. Impact Alpha has a list. Impact Assets creates their Impact Assets 50. So there are places you can go to look. I think oftentimes the best and most impactful opportunities are found in your own community. So if you are working with a nonprofit organization, like our donor advised funds folks with Peak Education, they identified this problem that there's this gap in money and we need to provide some bridging capital. Those opportunities, I think, exist in lots of different organizations. And so if you find something like that, think about how, who are the other partners you need to come alongside with, whether it's your donor advised fund provider or some sort of structure like that, and give it a shot, right? Give it a try. I think learning by doing is the best way to do it. I think the other thing we've seen, again, a lot of momentum around is people coming together. So if you are with a bunch of like-minded folks who are we have a bunch of folks thinking about ownership and assets and how we close the racial wealth gap. If you have folks like that, come together and start talking about, could we pool our assets? Could we do this together? Which shares the opportunity across a number of people, both in terms of risk and costs and opportunities and, surfacing things. We've seen a lot of momentum in that space. So I would say, look for those opportunities of people who've already been funded, ask around in your community, and then come together with others who care about things that you care about and see what comes up, see what you can do together. And if starting with grant making is the way to go to learn about organizations and create those relationships, fantastic. Start there and then move along that continuum of, right, could it be a recoverable grant? Would we like to do a 1% loan? Like what's really helpful for that organization and figure out then the partners to come alongside you to get that money out the door.
Okay, great advice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, Cindy, we got the chats, lots of stuff's coming up out of the chat.
Okay.
I have been looking for those ones that I think we might address, but also, looking to you to see if there's one that particularly grabs your attention.
I have not been paying attention to that.
No, that's okay. That's on us. Don't worry
Focused on
about it.
what I've been saying, so I'm not saying random
Well, we
things.
we did get a question. Any more you can tell us trends, data on multi-donor DAFs or pooled DAFs. So that's also part of the broader social finance conversation here in Canada is platforms pooling co-investing. So any more that you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of momentum behind that in the last 18 months. I think of the projects in my deal flow at this moment, um, the majority of them are people who want to aggregate capital and come together. And by that, I mean there's either a specific geography, there's a specific impact theme, or there's a deal that folks want to come together around. And a donor advised fund or a special purpose fund at a donor advised fund provider, and we don't have to get super wonky about that. But anyway, a pooled fund can be a great way to do that because it can gather that philanthropic capital. You can likely invest more than you might on your own. And again, it allows the investee to have only one investor as opposed to having 8 or 9 people coming together. And it also pools the resources around diligence or around surfacing those funds, and then provides some efficiencies again on the investment management and monitoring. Because making the investment is one thing. Then there's this amazing long-term relationship to manage and monitor that investment wisely over time and to understand how it's performing, what the impact metrics are, really creating that long-term relationship with the organization, which again, I think is one of the really great things about impact first investing, to do that. So I would say we still get lots of sort of one donor to one deal investments, but we're really seeing an uptake in folks wanting to come together to do this. And you can have a pooled donor advised fund where decisions are being made by groups and then run out of those funds. You can set up special purpose, but there's lots of ways to do that. But I think we're really seeing a lot of momentum there, and I think it's a great way to do this work. And so we're excited about figuring out even more ways to support that and coming together with other providers too. We work with, we think there's enough of this work for everyone. So we are happy to work with a number of other intermediaries to make all of this happen and to share what we're learning and what we're doing to make more of it possible.
Cindy, you're going to get a lot of LinkedIn connect requests following
Good. I
this
hope so.
discussion. I'm quite certain about that. I'm also getting a lot of questions about the role of community foundations. So I'll just read one of them and feel free to take it wherever you'd like. What do you think about community foundations' role in hosting donor advised funds? They are a nonprofit in tracking place-based needs in community. Community foundations, at least most, have to disclose all of their DAF and annual grant making.
Yes. So I think so any community foundation can do all of the things that we're talking about today. I think often they haven't necessarily built the infrastructure to do all of those things, because it does take a level of diligence, a level of entrepreneurial spirit, the right and supportive legal teams to make sure that everything's being documented correctly and in responsible ways. And it takes decision making that can move at the speed of investments and not necessarily at the speed of a quarterly meeting. And so
Okay.
I think for the ones that I have seen that do this really well, they've built systems for that. Many community foundations, which do an amazing job of supporting local needs, right, challenges, opportunities, all of those things. Many of them have set up their systems to do grant making, which is vital and hugely helpful. I think it takes some intentionality to set up the systems that are needed for impact first investing. And I see many of them on that journey, which is amazing because there are lots of assets held, and those community foundations really do understand their communities and understand those needs very well. And so they're uniquely positioned to be helpful. But I
Mhm.
think sometimes the infrastructure is a little bit, needs a little bit of support and building out.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Um, okay. A few questions getting into your work in particular. Do you use longer terms at all to be catalytic? 10, 25 years or more? Do you have structural tools that work across capital stacks that tie grants to other forms of deployed capital?
Yes, we do have some terms that are longer. I think when we start thinking about the 20 years, then there may be another opportunity for some of those things beyond that. And what I mean by that is there are sort of longer term systems and structures. There are CDFIs that can manage those sorts of things. Banks can take over after a certain point. So with some of these construction projects, once there's enough um, of a net asset there, then banks can finance that. And they're probably better suited to do those really, really extended terms. We do hold investments that are 10 to 15 years right now, depending on what's needed and what's asked for. So we can provide patient capital. I think, our role is not to replace traditional finance or the traditional systems and structures that exist. Our role is to fill those gaps in those systems. And so, again, when we think about a 30-year financing term for a mortgage, there are lots of systems and structures set up to do that. What we could do is provide some loan loss reserve or some guarantees or to buy down those rates for certain periods of time until that net asset increased that they could get a better rate. Like there's lots of ways to think about building out those stacks. We are not meant to replace a 30-year mortgage on a building, right? That's not something
Mhm.
that impact investing is meant to do. Patient capital is absolutely what we're meant to do. And I will say that we often, because we've created relationships with the investees, is when if things start to go sideways, or if there needs to be a grace period, or if there needs to be a loan extension, we are absolutely on board for that because we're here for impact.
Yeah, yeah, makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Thank you. So do DAFs, a question from earlier in the call, do DAFs charge management fees and carry? What are the setup costs and ongoing costs like?
So I can only speak for Impact Charitable because I do
Yeah,
not intimately know other people's systems and structures. So we do have DAF fund management fees, and that's on a tiered structure. So depending how much is in the DAF, we charge on that. We charge a one-time transaction fee to make an impact first investment because there is work that goes into that.
yeah,
And I think part of what we're continuing to build out in the impact investing sector is the value that we create for that work. There's a great study by the Miller Center here in the US on the actual cost of impact investing. And I think there perhaps are some that think because impact investing costs a little bit more that it's inefficient. It's actually the
okay.
cost of inclusion. And so, as again, we think about setting these different systems and structures, there is a cost to that. So, that's my little diatribe on like, you actually have to pay for impact investing. And we
It's a great
charge.
diatribe. Don't hold back.
Okay. I will try to look up the Miller Center report, or if someone else has it, they can pop it in the chat. But it's a really useful look at the cost of investing and that actually impact first investing firms move more capital more quickly. And there is a slightly higher cost because we're looking at impact, risk, and return, all of the things.
Yeah,
So I think it's a great read for those of you who care about this sort of thing. Um, so we charge a one-time investment transaction fee, and then we charge on the assets in that DAF. We don't charge a carry. We don't do those kinds of things. We are set up as a nonprofit organization, and so our mission is to do this. So what I want to make sure I'm covering is the cost of my amazing team who does remarkable work every day, that we're able to exist in a responsible and secure way, given that we're managing money. But we're not here to pay our shareholders. We're not here to pay our CEO an exorbitant salary that has been given to that person, right? We're really trying to right size our work for a quality team and quality work and making it accessible and manageable for folks who want to participate in that space. So yearly fund management fee and then one-time transaction fees to make those things possible. That's how we work. So others may
yeah.
have different models about how they do things.
Well, and you did mention assets under management not being a way that you're measuring performance at your own company. Getting a couple questions on that. Anything you want to tell us more about how you're managing performance of thinking about this differently?
Yeah. So as an intermediary, for those of you who think about impact measurement and management, you know that that's a tricky place because we are not necessarily implementing the down payment assistance program for first-time Black homeowners. So we can't take credit for the amazing work that Deerfield Fund is doing, right? Because that's not our work. So
Yeah.
we think about, our unofficial tagline is we move more money in more ways to more people and places. And so those are the things we measure is are we moving more money? So money out the door, not money that we're sitting on, money that's moved out in grants, that's moved out in expenditure responsibility grants, that's moved out in investments um, more money in more ways. So you saw the 19 different ways that we have moved money. We think it's really important to be flexible in structure to get to impact. So we think a lot about that. And by more people and places, we mean those who've been excluded from the system systemically, all of the things over the years. And so are we reaching folks with capital who haven't had access to that? And those folks who really understand impact in a way that's meaningful. So they understand their local communities, they understand the identities that they're representing. Those are the people we want to reach. And so we think a lot about what our portfolio looks like in terms of leadership. And so last year, two-thirds of our investments went to organizations led by people of color. And we know,
Okay.
particularly in the US, that the statistics support that those are the folks who've been left out of the system. And more than half of our investments went to organizations led by women. And we know that women have been left out of those systems and finance in the past as well. And so those are the measurements that we look at. Are we moving more money out the door? Are we getting more money off the sidelines? And how is it getting there and who's it going to?
Okay. Okay, wonderful. Um, just scrolling through, it's a lot of good discussion happening here. A lot of
Good.
questions on how do we get at that DAF money
You
continuing.
bet.
Um, yeah, anything else that you want to tell us about transparency? About capital being directed by a small border committee, what questions we should be asking about transparency, accountability, and who gets to decide where that money goes.
Yeah. That's the ultimate question in philanthropy, right? Like we have been struggling with that in the US since the turn of the last century, right? If you think
Okay.
about the robber barons who set up the first foundations, right? Rockefeller, big oil, like all of the things, right? This concentration of wealth has been something that we've been trying to right size for a long, probably forever, as it turns out, for a very long time. I think we continue to struggle with that in the US. I think even though many private foundations have to share more information, they don't necessarily have to share how they're making decisions. It's really difficult to figure out how to get on that board. So you're
Hmm.
shifting the who about who's making decisions. Um, we try as much as we can when we have the opportunity to set up a community-led investment committee. And so we have a number of funds where the source of capital is not part of the decision making about the capital. And what I mean by that is that the donors are not the ones deciding where the money is going. That
Okay.
isn't always possible. We do try to set that up as much as we can to try to get at some of this, like that there is more transparency there because there's a separation between sort of the wealth accumulator and the disbursement of those funds. I think we should continue to ask those questions about who gets to decide and why. But this is a big question that we've been wrestling with in philanthropy for a long, long time. I'm not sure I have, well, I know I don't have all the answers, but these are the right questions to ask. And as we think about impact investing, we can do a lot to think about the who and how and the moving the money, but until we change who is making decisions about the money, we won't, I don't think, achieve what I hope we can in shifting our systems and making them more equitable. We're in some preliminary conversations with some folks about building a talent pipeline program to try to bring more people into impact investing. So I think there's a lot of perceptions that you have to be a guru in finance. I don't have a finance degree, right? There's no, it's hard to see the pathway into this work. And I think we're having some conversations around like how do we create a better pathway and for more people? So how do we create paid opportunities for people to learn? as opposed to saying you have to do a bunch
Okay.
of free internships or this has to be your side hustle,
Mhm.
right? If we really want to shift the makeup of who's in this space, we need to create those pathways that are possible for people. Again, I don't think we have all the answers, but we're trying to think about how do we create more transparent pathways into this work, into these decision-making roles, so that we can break this transparency, open things up, shift some of these decision makers, which I hope will lead us to a more transparent and open place about all of this.
Well, Cindy, you may not have had all of the answers, but you sure had a lot of them. Um, so as we approach the end of the hour, I'll just ask you, are there any final thoughts that you would like to share?
I really appreciate that you all are thinking about as donor advised funds start to become much more of a thing in Canada, and then they will continue to be in the US, these important questions. They are the right questions to ask, and I do think there are opportunities to make these changes, both in like again, I'm going to go back to master narrative and policy, right? Like how do we
Yeah.
bring those things together and what does that look like in your context? How do you start now so when you're at 17 billion, when you're at the 250 billion that we are at in the US, that things are different, right? And the opportunities are different. So I really appreciate that you're asking these questions. And I think continuing to have all of the folks on this call think about all of the ways we can use donor advised funds to catalyze change is important, and really focusing on the catalytic nature of this capital to do amazing
Mhm.
things is great. So love that you're thinking about it, and hope that you all can do a much better job and get ahead of it as we try to we're trying to catch up now. I think hopefully you all can be a little bit more out in front.
Well, and we appreciate all your wisdom in helping us along that journey. So thank you so much, Cindy. I mean, we, I can't say thank you enough. How much we appreciate how much you shared today, how clear you are in your explanations, and how many examples you have that we can learn from. I'm going to give one quick plug. If you're interested in learning more about blended finance, we've got, the blended finance community of practice. We've got lots of opportunities coming up, including our foundations and blended finance course. The 7-week course begins October 15th, and early bird pricing ends at the end of August. And lots of other opportunities, including these webinars. So if you have a topic you'd like us to address, a speaker you'd like us to feature, as always, reach out to me, Tasha at Spring. I think Lorraine's going to put my contact info there. And other than that, just thank you everyone for joining. And we appreciate Cindy being part of this conversation, and we appreciate all of you for coming and joining us today.
It was my pleasure. It was such a treat to be with you.
All right. Well, on that note, take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.